Gresham College presents Measures Beyond Money, Part 3, Green Growth, The What, Why and How, by Paul Ekins, Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy, UCL.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks for asking me back, and welcome to my hometown, so to speak. Firstly, I'm no longer at the Energy Institute. UCL has set up a new Institute of Sustainable Resources, but the Energy Institute is our sister institute within the faculty, so I'm still very happy to be cast as belonging to it. I think the point of interaction between what I'm going to say and the previous discussion was very much this issue of sustainability, and you'll gather during the course of my chat that I have a particular take on that. But I'm going to start with ideas about a green economy, and as you might expect from an academic, especially talking about a relatively new concept that is widely used in political discourse, I'm going to offer a few thoughts as to what this term means, and I think it's more easily characterized than defined. So if we saw one of these beasts in one of these hypothetical countries, because I don't think an economy like this exists, and perhaps it could not exist, it would have very low levels of carbon and other emissions to the atmosphere. It would have very high levels of resource productivity, measured as the quantity of useful output that is generated divided by the quantity of resources used in generating it. It would be an economy where human activity as a total remained within the local and global planetary limits, and it wouldn't damage human health, it wouldn't deplete renewable resources or cause climate change or ecosystem degradation, because it would take due account of the values and human benefits which the environment provides, and we had some discussion on that. It's an idea which some might say its time had come. I actually did my PhD in this area some years ago when it was very low in terms of public profile. It's now much higher than that, which is obviously a great pleasure for me, and it intersects with these two great public policy debates, environmental sustainability and the GDP and beyond discussion, some aspects of which we had earlier. And then I suppose my first kind of controversial statement is that a green economy may or may not experience GDP growth. And if a green economy did experience GDP growth, then I would call that green growth. And in order to just think a bit about what green growth might be, I think we have to ask, where does economic growth come from? And it's a relevant question because not all societies have experienced economic growth. In fact, it's a relatively recent human invention as far as we can see. But I think we're pretty clear about where it comes from and what causes it. And actually, it's the first bullet point there. It's applied knowledge and innovation. It derives from turning non-resources into resources. I use the example of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have existed for a very long time, much longer than humans, but they didn't become resources until about 1750, when people discovered how to use them. And they suddenly became resources. Sand is another very common material, but until people learned how to turn it into transistors, it wasn't a terribly useful resource. Investment in knowledge and innovation is at an all-time high globally. There are more scientists and educated people living now than there have been in accumulation throughout history. There's no shortage of renewable energy, as that first talk on energy showed us, if we knew how to harness it cost effectively, and there's no shortage of materials if we knew how to manipulate and use them. And it is the knowledge to do those things that will bring about economic growth in the future, as it has in the past. And thinking of it like that, I'm struck by the kind of non-growth movements, if I can put it like that. Some of my colleagues in the Green movement or even the degrowth movement, which I hear there are conferences on, though I've not been to one, because I'm not sure how policymakers would stop economic growth even if they wanted to, in the sense that if economic growth comes about by behaving more intelligently and applying knowledge, it's quite clear that we can stop economic growth by behaving stupidly, and the financial sector has given a very good example of that in the years leading up to 2009. But if we behave intelligently and turn non-resources into resources and find better ways of doing things, economic growth will result. But, and this is the green bit clearly, economic growth must be consistent with environmental sustainability, and there's ample evidence now that it isn't. And I think that a lot of the confusion in this area resides in the fact that when people talk about growth, and I'm afraid that this applies to people whom I admire enormously in the economics fraternity, like Herman Daly, who has written very extensively on the whole question of economic growth, GDP growth, the steady-state economy, etc. They don't always make it clear what kind of growth they're talking about. Because physical growth is clearly one kind of growth, the mobilization of energy and materials through the economy, and economies do this, and as we heard before, it requires energy and energy. And equally clearly, in a finite world, that kind of growth cannot continue indefinitely. But that actually is not what economists are interested in at all. And when they say economic growth, they don't mean that. They mean the growth of GDP, which, as we discussed earlier, is the value expressed in currency, expressed in terms of money, the value of the goods and services that flow through the economy in the course of a year. And equally, there are economists who tend to equate that with human welfare, but I've not met any. I've read some of them sometimes, especially when they're trying to do fancy mathematical things, and they can't make it tractable without equating welfare with some rather simplistic concept like consumption. But most economists will freely admit, as Stephen Smith did, and he after all is Professor of Economics, which is more than I am at this august institution, freely admit that there are many things that are not included in the measure of GDP, the monetary measure of goods and services that flow through the economy. And that human welfare, economists that I admire enormously, like Rufi Hüting, have laid out lists of other factors that should be taken into account if we were interested in judging whether welfare in an economy had increased, as well or instead of the growth of monetized goods and services. So that then, having combined my first ideas about the green economy with my second ideas about what growth is, I come to my thoughts about green growth. It's increases in GDP, in other words, it's a form of economic growth that either keeps the economy within the safe operating space, if we were in that happy condition of being already in the safe operating space within which the environment works, or in the condition that we're now in, moves it back there. And from our current condition, the one thing we can be quite certain of is that green growth requires decoupling of GDP growth from resource use and environmental impacts. And there's an enormous amount of policy work aimed at achieving that. You might ask, well, why should we bother with green growth? You may ask, why should we bother with growth at all? And I just refer back to Malcolm Grant's first comments when he was introducing the whole conference. If we want to spend more money on health services, and as we get older, certainly as I get older, I visit doctors rather more than I did in my youth because I was very, very healthy. So if society is like me and it's getting older and it wants to spend more money on health services, and doctors and nurses and hospitals all cost money, then either we will have to take that money from somewhere else in the economy, or we will have to have economic growth. And that's why, broadly, politicians who like to offer more health services to their electorates want economic growth, and why electorates who want more health services, especially as they get older, also want economic growth. But it's got to be green because of some of the facts up there, which are quite uncontentious. I think someone said in the previous session, we can't all live like current Germans, and we certainly can't all live like current Americans. On a number of environmental measures, Americans per capita use rather more than average Europeans. But everybody wants to live like that. And most of the people who don't live like that probably couldn't even live the way we live, multiplied by 9 billion. And the big thing that's changed as I've got older is that the very large populations in Asia now can increasingly live like that, and they're going for it like there was no tomorrow. And indeed, there may be no tomorrow if we don't sort out the environmental dimensions of the growth processes. Here are some of recent examples of what Herman Daly has always called the wild facts. And it's quite clear that some of these climate-related impacts are now having measurable effects on GDP. In other words, the thought that brown growth can continue indefinitely into the future and that green growth is somehow something nice to have for a small minority of green people is shown to be the false assumption that it always has been. Brown growth is unsustainable, and those signs of unsustainability, i.e. not being able to go on, are becoming increasingly apparent in increasing numbers of countries. Thailand, Russia, US, etc. And indeed, we spend the money as taxpayers to employ a chief scientific advisor. The current chief scientific advisor, Professor Sir John Beddington, much better scientist than me. In 2009, he gave a paper looking forward, if that's the right word, to a perfect storm of crises to do with the availability of energy, food and water as soon as 2030. Well, so far, governments don't seem to be taking these kinds of utterances from chief scientific advisors as seriously as they might, but that's, I think, further evidence that the unsustainability of current growth patterns. This is a little piece of modelling from the UNEP Green Economy report from 2011. I'm reliably told, and I'm busy getting the money to look into this in much more detail, that the model that produced this diagram is rubbish. I put it up there because it seems to me to be intuitively right. And it is just about the only piece of modelling of its kind, and I kind of do quite a lot of modelling of this kind. It's just about the only piece of modelling of this kind which does seem to me to be intuitively right. What it shows is that there's the growth rate, which you can see goes from 0 to 5% up the y-axis, and then a timeline along the x-axis with a black line of 2010 that separates actual data from projections. And the nice thing about projections, and why you know that they're wrong, is that they're always nice and smooth. And the one thing we know about the projections in the future is that they won't be smooth, but kind of that's what models produce, and it's quite impossible to predict all those spikes. But why I like that picture is that it gives you two business as usual projections whereby the world goes on the way it is, and you can see that the growth rate falls from an average of about 3%, which is what we've experienced over recent decades, down to 1%, and then it sort of, or 1.5%, and then it stays there. And there are two business as usual projections, one which is just going on as we are, and then the red one, which is an enhanced investment projection. What if global society decided to consume less and invest more? And the green projection is where it invests more in what Michael right at the beginning called natural capital. In other words, it invests in building up the stocks of natural capital which are currently being very much depleted, including things like the capacity of the Earth to have a sustainable climate or a stable climate, including that in the stock of natural capital. And you will see that at some point in the future, and actually it's in the very near future in this case, around about 2017, the green growth rate starts to exceed the brown growth rate, because the rate of depletion of natural capital actually starts to cause growth rates to fall because of the sorts of effects that were on the previous slide to do with climate. Well, we know that to get that offers us an unprecedented policy challenge. The Stern Review looked at that challenge in great detail for climate change and identified that we need carbon pricing, and then we need some technology policy, and we need to promote behaviour change. All rather difficult things, very topical as we move into the publication of an energy bill in this country. But we need to apply these insights of the Stern Review to use of other environmental resources, particularly those identified by John Beddington as likely to contribute to the perfect storm: water, renewable resources, and biodiversity. So, what kinds of policy approaches might we adopt? The Chair will be glad to know that this is my second to last slide. The good news is, and I say this as someone who's been active as a policy academic for a number of years, is that the innovation in the policy process is enormous. We have seen more new policy concepts and more new actual policies, from trading schemes to voluntary agreements to information labels to everything under the sun, than it would almost have been possible to imagine, which is very good. The bad news, of course, is that they haven't yet been applied with sufficient stringency to turn round some of these wild facts, even in the UK, where they're applied much more diligently than they are in some other countries. But there has been enormous progress along a number of dimensions. I mentioned some of the waste, so there's a couple of waste concepts there. Well, the waste hierarchy has underpinned this country's ability to get from a recycling rate of about 3% in 1997 to something in excess of 40% now, which is quite a large change over a relatively short period of time. And it's not all cost. And this is the thing I think that is the real excitement about the green growth, green economy idea, is that we are so extraordinarily wasteful with the way that we use resources, and the businesses in this country are so far from being on the edge of the production possibility frontier that economists routinely place them at in many of their analyses, that there are enormous negative cost opportunities for resource efficiency, for reducing resource use and environmental impact, and making profits. I've talked already about innovation and investment. If we're moving into a world in which more and more countries are going to want to move down the green economy, green growth route, and I very much hope we are moving into that world, then those countries that are most innovative in developing and deploying the technologies that are useful in such an economy are going to find that they can export them, the UK is relatively successful in this area already. Everyone in this room seems to love Germany, and I have to say Germany is even more successful than we are in that particular area, so there's something there to learn. Another benefit will be the increased resource security. We'll have reduced vulnerability to the kinds of things that John Beddington was talking about: food scarcity, water scarcity, energy scarcity, and potentially the scarcity of rare materials. And of course, the whole point of the green economy is that we will have environmental improvement, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, hopefully a less unstable climate. A stable climate is probably too much now to hope for, but a less unstable climate and a more pleasant place in which to live. Thanks very much.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.